Aloha and welcome. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about what I consider to be one of the most confusing topics when dealing with classes, and that is class and instance object types. So in this lesson, they describe how whenever you're using user-defined classes, that you get two additional types of objects, and those are class objects and instance objects. We've talked about this a little bit before. Your class object basically is what you use as your blueprint. And that's what you use to create your actual instance objects. So you can just think of a class object kind of as like a factory for your instance objects. So in order to actually create that, use that init, that dunder init method that we talked about. So they give you some really good examples here, and then they get into discussing class attributes. And this is where it gets a little bit murky, and this is where we're going to go through some examples. There's something called a class attribute, which is an attribute that is the same across all of your the same across all objects of the same class. And then you have your instance attributes. And your instance attributes are the attributes that can be changed per instance. But there are some very interesting things about it, and it has to do with the namespace of it. So when you create a class, or when we create an object, you've got your instances namespace. In other words, you've got this area of memory that has all of the, you can say locally defined variables and whatnot for this instance. Then you have the actual class namespace, and the two are linked together. So you have not just your instances namespace, but you also have the class that it's derived from. So you've got both of these namespaces. And when you define an attribute as a class attribute, it's up at the higher level. So when you actually reference a variable, if you're trying to reference your variable, it's going to look first at your instance. If it doesn't find that in the instance scope, it's going to go up to the class scope and it's going to look for it there. Making it all even more confusing is you can access both your instance attributes and your class attributes by using the self keyword that we talked about before when we talked about the self dot attribute name using your dot notation. So that's what makes this really confusing, because it's hard to tell. So if you actually have double defined something, let's say you have that person that we created before and you have eye color defined at the class level, and then you reference self.eye color, it's a question of, if you have it defined locally as well as locally, meaning in the instance, as well as at the higher level in the class, it's going to operate off of the one in the instance. So it can be confusing in that sense. So let's go ahead and get into some examples here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and bring up handy dandy VS Code. And we're going to take the example from before with a little bit of modification here. So we've got our class person, and I have right here a class attribute, eye color equals brown. And it's a class attribute, you can tell, because it's defined at the same level as all of our methods. So I'm instantiating one person for John and person for Bob, and they both share the eye color here. And when they're both instantiated, they get these, which are instance attributes here. So they get instance attributes of male and 18, but they're also sharing brown there. So if I go in here and I say John dot eye color equals purple, and then I want to see what my eye color is, John dot tell eye color, we're going to see that it's purple. But hey, this is the class level, right? Or so I think it is. I think that I'm modifying the class level. So that should turn the eye color purple for Bob as well, right? Wink, wink. It's not going to be that way. So we're going to have After we, let's see, type eye color, let's go ahead and define them both before we start modifying stuff. So, oops, hold on, let me over here. So what we're doing here is we're defining or instantiating John, we're instantiating Bob, then we're setting John's eye color to purple, then we're saying John.tell eye color and Bob.tell eye color. We know that both of their eyes should start off as brown, but then we're changing John's to purple. But we're doing something that's defined at the class attribute level. So we would think that this would affect both objects, because after all, this is class, right? Well, that's not exactly what happens. So let's go ahead and run this. And we see that we get purple because we just changed John to purple, but then Bob is surprisingly still brown. Why is this? Well, it has to do with the fact that the tell eye color is using self here. And self is, it's modifying the instance version here. So we're modifying the instance level. We're keeping it John. If we want to modify the class level, what we're going to have to do, instead of saying John, which is the instance, we're going to have to say person, which is the class. So when we do this, we're accessing the eye color for the class level. So if we do this, we should see that both turn to purple. And we run it, and indeed they both do go to purple. And that has to do with, if we use John.eye color, we're actually modifying the instance. So the instance is there, but also we have the class level is still brown, but when we're looking for eye color, it's going to search in the instance first. So it's getting purple, and then it didn't get the brown from before. So this is confusing. I fully sympathize for anybody that's getting their minds melted here, but that's what's going on here. And it takes some playing around with this just to kind of figure that out. So take your time to absorb this. It's really tricky in that regard. And using that self, the self here, the crazy thing about that is that self can access both your instance or your class level. So yeah, you've got to be careful with that. It's best not to use the same names at both levels. It's a good idea to not use like eye color at an instance level and eye color also at the class level. You don't want that kind of a conflict, because if you define it locally, and you also define, when I say locally, I mean at the instance level, but you're also defining it at the class level, you're going to get confused as to which one you're actually modifying. It's just hard to. It's nice to use things like, I'm using eye color as brown for person. That's really not a good example, but teeth count, perhaps that would be a good one. That would be a good one. Everyone starts out with the same number of teeth, which is 0, I guess. But yeah, so we want to use eye color, or we want to use our class level things as kind of constants that are going to be the same across all of our objects, really. That's the best way to use it. And then if you need to, you can modify it for individual ones. So anyhow, that's the confusing world of class versus instance attributes. And I know this is confusing, and if you have any questions, absolutely feel free to reach out to me, an email, send me a text or an email, and we can get together in Zoom and we can go over this, play around with some examples, because this is rather difficult to grasp the first couple of times you try it. But again, you just have to remember that we have two namespaces here. We've got the instance namespace and we've got the class namespace that's attached to it. They're linked to each other. And when you're accessing an attribute and you're using the self dot attribute name, it's going to check your instance level first, then it's going to check the higher class one if it's not found. If you have it defined in both levels, you're going to get your instance level first. So keep that in mind. It's just, again, it's best not to try to use the same name for a local, slash instance attribute. It's better to use unique names between the two of them and not use the same thing for both levels. That will get very confusing, as if it wasn't confusing enough already. So also keep in mind that if you're going to change that class level, you're going to have to use the class name here and say like person dot attribute equals whatever. That will affect it across all instances. But if you do it for the individual, if you were to just do it for like here, John.iColor, what you're doing is you're setting not the class attribute, you're actually setting right there what you're doing is you're setting the instance level attribute. So it's going to be totally different. So keep that in mind. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and email. Yes, this is confusing. It's it's one of the more difficult things to grasp. So take your time, play around with some examples. I know that a lot of people aren't installing VS Code. They're just relying on their zyBooks for doing their projects and everything. It really would be helpful if you've got this locally on your system, even if you're just using the standard Python interpreter. It's really a good idea to try that out. Try some of these things, and get a feel for what a class looks like, what it feels like. Try instantiating some objects from it, and playing around with accessing attributes and such. That's really the best way of grasping it. Mess it up, play around with it, do that, because you really can't do that in zyBooks. So anyway, I will see you in the next lesson.